I got a call about property being removed from this location. Want to tell me what's going on here?
Yes, sir. We're deacons of this church. We are clearing equipment after Sunday service. That's our
Please,
church van.
all of you, right now.
With respect, I have not been told I'm being aimed.
Nobody called 911 because a crime was happening. They called because 6 black men were working, and someone decided that was enough. Officer Haskell of the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department responded to that call the way he responded to most things, with his mind already made up before his boots hit the ground. He had 17 prior complaints and a department that had absorbed every single one of them without consequence, which had taught him exactly the wrong lesson. He dismissed a pastor, humiliated deacons on a public street, and put a retired military man face first into the concrete in front of his own church congregation. What Haskell didn't know, what every second of that body cam footage was quietly, methodically preserving, was that he had just assaulted a man the United States Marine Corps had decorated twice for valor, and that before the sun went down, phones across 4 counties would be ringing. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe that a badge should never be a license to humiliate innocent people, then hit that like button and subscribe to Deep Truth. Justice only prevails when people are watching. It was 2:47 in the afternoon when Eunice Prattle slowed her Nissan Altima to a crawl on Calverton Road in Hargrove County, Georgia. She was heading home from her sister's house on the other side of town, windows up, gospel radio low, when she spotted them. 6 men in dress shirts and dark slacks loading folding chairs and sound equipment into the back of a white Chevy Express van parked along the curb. The doors of Triumphant Grace Missionary Baptist Church stood wide open behind them. The Georgia sun was full and unforgiving, sitting high in a cloudless sky, and the men were moving with the easy, deliberate rhythm of people who had done this exact task many Sundays before. Eunice didn't get out of her car. She didn't roll down her window. She didn't walk up to the men and ask a single question. She picked up her phone and dialed 911, telling the dispatcher there was a group of black men loading what appeared to be valuable items from the church into a van, and that it looked like it could be a robbery. She drove away before the first unit arrived. Triumphant Grace Missionary Baptist Church had stood at 4814 Calverton Road since 1961. It was a modest but dignified building. Red brick facade, white wooden columns framing the entrance. A marquee sign out front that still read, "Sunday service 10 a.m." Pressed toward the mark in black removable letters, the congregation had been rooted in that building for over 6 decades. Through 3 pastors, 2 renovations, and more funerals, weddings, and graduations than anyone had kept full count of. That Sunday, morning service had run long. Not unusually so. Pastor Thaddeus Odom had delivered a 47-minute sermon on perseverance that drew 3 standing ovations and 1 woman to the altar. By the time the benediction was spoken and the last handshakes were exchanged in the vestibule, it was pushing 1:30 in the afternoon. The deacon board had stayed behind, as they always did, to break down the auxiliary chairs brought in for the overflow crowd, disconnect the portable PA system, and load everything into the church van for storage at the annex building 2 miles down Calverton Road. It was work they had done together, without complaint, for years. Donovan Mercer, 54, was the kind of man whose presence in a room registered before he said a word. Not because he was loud. He wasn't. Because he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had been in enough real situations that manufactured urgency no longer impressed him. He stood 6 feet even, with broad shoulders that his dress shirt still couldn't quite contain, and close-cropped gray at his temples that he'd earned. He was a full deacon, a 27-year member of Triumphant Grace, and a retired United States Marine Corps Sergeant Major. 3 combat tours, 2 commendations for valor, and a record that the Marine Corps didn't hand out lightly. On Sunday afternoons after service, he was simply a man helping his church. He was guiding a stack of folding chairs down the concrete steps when the cruiser pulled up. Officer Darren Haskell, 38, worked out of the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department substation on Mill Creek Bypass. He had been with the department for 9 years. In that time, 17 complaints had been filed against him. Excessive force, unlawful detention, racially discriminatory conduct. 17 complaints, 0 sustained. The department had cleared him each time with language so similar across the paperwork that it read less like independent review and more like a template. Haskell had learned to interpret that institutional silence as permission. He pulled his cruiser to the curb at 4814 Calverton Road at 2:51 p.m., 4 minutes after Eunice's call was dispatched. He did not park and observe. He did not take in the open church doors, the men in dress clothes, the Sunday program still visible in shirt pockets, the obvious context of what he was looking at. He stepped out of the vehicle with his hand already resting near his belt and walked toward the van with his chin forward and his jaw set. A man who had already written the story before he'd read a single word of it. Donovan noticed him first. He set the chairs down against the van and straightened up. Around him, Deacons Sylvester Briggs and Cassius Renford paused what they were doing, reading the energy the way men who've been in these situations before learn to read it fast and carefully. "You want to tell me what's going on here?" Haskell said. Not a greeting, not an introduction, a challenge. Donovan answered him evenly. "Yes, sir. We're deacons of this church. We're clearing equipment after Sunday service." He gestured toward the open doors behind him. "This is our church van. We do this every week." Haskell's eyes moved over the group slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he's decided he's looking at suspects and is just working out the details. "I got a call about property being removed from this location," he said. "I'm going to need to see ID from everybody here, every single one of you." It was at that moment that the front doors of Triumphant Grace opened wider and Pastor Thaddeus Odom stepped out onto the top step, still in his vestments. The deep burgundy robe with gold trim that he wore for the first Sunday of each month. He was a compact, silver-haired man of 67, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of unhurried authority that comes from decades of leading people through hard things. "Officer," he called out, descending the steps with his hand extended. "I'm Pastor Thaddeus Odom. I'm the senior pastor here. These are our deacons. They are clearing our equipment. I can assure you everything here is completely in order." Haskell looked at him. Then he looked back at the men by the van. Then he looked back at the pastor. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back. This is an active investigation." Pastor Odom stopped walking. His hand, still extended, lowered slowly. "An investigation," he repeated. "Into what, exactly? These men work for this church. That is our van. Those are our chairs." "Sir," Haskell's voice dropped in a way that wasn't quieter, it was harder. "I'm not going to ask you again to step back." Behind the pastor, the doors of Triumphant Grace had filled. Word had traveled back inside the way it always does in a tight congregation. Fast and through proximity. Arletta Simmons, 71, who'd been repinning her church hat in the vestibule mirror, was now standing in the doorway. Deacon Beaumont Hicks, who had gone inside to retrieve his car keys, was now on the top step. Rufus and Lorinda Crane, who had been finishing the last of the sweet tea in the fellowship hall, were moving toward the glass doors to see what the cluster of people at the entrance was looking at. Within 4 minutes of Haskell's arrival, approximately 40 members of the congregation were watching from the steps in the open doorway of their own church. Haskell turned back to the men at the van. "IDs," he said. "All of you, now." Sylvester and Cassius exchanged a look, the kind that doesn't need words, and reached for their wallets. Donovan Mercer did not move. He stood with his hands visible, relaxed at his sides, and he spoke with the composure of a man who had been trained to maintain clarity in conditions far worse than a parking lot confrontation on a Sunday afternoon. "With respect," Donovan said, "I haven't been told I'm being detained. I haven't been told what crime I'm suspected of committing, and I'm standing in front of my own church. I'm going to need a lawful reason before I provide identification." The air on Calverton Road went very still. Haskell stared at him for a long moment. The body cam on his chest was running. The congregation on the steps was watching. The Georgia sun was still sitting high and unforgiving in a cloudless sky. And then Haskell took 3 steps forward, and Donovan Mercer's Sunday ended on the concrete. Donovan Mercer hit the concrete at 2:57 in the afternoon. In front of his own church, in front of his pastor, in front of people who had known him for nearly 3 decades. Haskell came at him fast. No warning, no final verbal command, no moment where any reasonable person watching could say they saw de-escalation attempted. He grabbed Donovan by the shoulder, twisted him, and drove him down onto the sidewalk with the full weight of his body. Donovan's cheek met the concrete. His hands were already open and visible when it happened. The steps of triumphant grace went silent in a way that was different from quiet. It was the silence of people witnessing something they could not immediately process. The kind that sits in the chest before it becomes sound. Arletta Simmons pressed both hands over her mouth. Rufus Crane stepped forward instinctively before his wife caught his arm. A child near the door. No older than 7, still in his clip-on tie. Looked up at the adults around him, trying to understand what their faces meant. Sylvester Briggs took a half step toward Donovan and stopped when Haskell's hand shot up. "Nobody move," Haskell said. His voice was loud now, wide open, carrying across the parking lot. "Everybody stay where you are." He pressed his knee into Donovan's back and reached for his cuffs. Donovan did not struggle. He did not resist. He kept his body as still as he could manage with 210 pounds of officer on his spine and the rough texture of Calverton Road asphalt pressed against the side of his face. He had been in situations where panic was the most dangerous option available, and this was one of them. He breathed, and he stayed still. Haskell called for backup at 2:58 p.m. What happened next said everything about how he had framed the situation in his own mind. He didn't request one additional unit. He didn't ask for a supervisor. He called it in as a resistive subject with a large group of individuals failing to comply. Language that brought 3 additional squad cars to 4814 Calverton Road within 6 minutes. Lights and sirens on a Sunday afternoon, rolling up on a Baptist church where the marquee sign out front still read, "Press toward the mark." 4 officers total were now on the scene. They fanned out across the sidewalk and parking lot with the posture of men who had arrived expecting a situation already in progress. Hezekiah walked down the steps toward the nearest officer, his voice measured and clear, identifying himself and explaining what was happening. The officer told him to stay on the steps. When Hezekiah continued to explain, the officer stepped toward him and said it again. Not as a request. Cassius Renford had his ID already out, arm extended, trying to move things toward calm. One of the newly arrived officers took it without acknowledgement and walked it back to his cruiser to run it. Sylvester was told to put his hands where they could be seen, and he did, standing with his palms open and facing outward, wearing his Sunday shirt with a church program still folded in the breast pocket. Donovan was raised from the ground and placed against the side of the church van, cuffed, still saying nothing. There was a scrape running along his left cheekbone. He stood straight despite it. By 3:04 p.m., the number of congregation members watching from the steps had grown to well over 100. People who had been pulling out of the parking lot had stopped their cars and gotten back out. Others who had already driven away received phone calls from people still on the scene and turned around. Lorinda Crane had her phone up recording. So did 3 other members near the top of the steps. Nobody on the law enforcement side told them to stop, likely because there were too many to address and the cameras were already everywhere. Hezekiah Robert, 78, a founding member of Triumphant Grace who had helped lay the brick on that building's front walkway in 1961, sat down on the top step because his legs would not hold the weight of what he was watching. Opaline Garrett, who sang in the senior choir and had known Donovan since he came home from his first deployment, stood with her arms crossed tight over her chest and her eyes never leaving the man cuffed against the van. Pastor Thaddeus stood at the bottom of the steps, separated from his deacons by a line that hadn't been drawn with tape but was understood clearly by everyone present. He had his hands folded in front of him. He was not shouting. He had pastored long enough to know that raising his voice in that moment would only be used against the men standing in front of their own church in handcuffs. So he stood and he watched, and he made sure the officers knew they were being witnessed. Haskell, for his part, moved through the scene like a man who believed he was in control of it. He collected IDs, spoke to his fellow officers in low tones, and ran each name through dispatch. He had not yet looked up at the congregation on the steps with anything resembling concern. He had not asked to speak with the pastor again. He had not walked back to the open church doors to verify in any way the straightforward explanation that had been offered to him within 30 seconds of his arrival. He was waiting on the ID checks to come back clean so he could find another angle, and the whole congregation could see that was exactly what he was doing. What came back instead was not what any of them expected. The radio crackled. The dispatcher's voice was flat and routine, reading information the way dispatchers do. No drama, no editorial, just data delivered in the standard rhythm of a department that processes hundreds of calls a day. But the parking lot of Triumphant Grace Missionary Baptist Church was quiet enough that the words carried. And every person within earshot heard exactly who Darren Haskell had just put face down on the concrete. The dispatcher's voice came through at 3:11 p.m. flat. Routine. The kind of voice that has read thousands of records and long stopped registering what they mean. Unit 4, subject ID confirmed. Mercer, Donovan L., date of birth, March 9th, 1970. No warrants, no priors, clean record. A brief pause. The sound of keys, the sound of a database loading one more file. Additionally, flagging a federal service record attached to this ID, United States Marine Corps. Retired. Rank Sergeant Major. Service period 1991 to 2018. 3 combat deployments. Commendation for Valor 2004. Second Commendation for Valor 2011. The radio went quiet. Nobody on that sidewalk said a word. Haskell stood near the hood of his cruiser with the radio in his hand. One of the officers who had responded as backup. A younger man named Briley, who had been with the department less than 2 years. Looked over at Haskell and then looked away quickly, the way people do when they don't want to be associated with something they can see is about to go badly. Donovan stood against the van, still cuffed, still straight. He had known what the check would return before the dispatcher finished the first sentence. He had carried that record his entire adult life, and it had never once made him feel like it should have protected him from what just happened on this sidewalk. It shouldn't have needed to. But he also knew what it meant for the man standing by the cruiser, and he watched Haskell's face without expression. The congregation heard it. Every word. The steps of Triumphant Grace had been silent for several minutes already, but this was a different kind of silence. The kind that has weight and temperature. Opaline Garrett unfolded her arms slowly. Hezekiah Robert, still seated on the top step, bowed his head. Not in defeat, in the particular grief of a man who has lived long enough to know that dignity has to be proven in this country, and that proving it still doesn't always protect you. Pastor Thaddeus stood at the bottom of the steps and did not move. His face was still. His eyes were on Donovan. The phone calls started within minutes. It is not fully known who made the first one, whether it was a congregation member who recognized the name and had a contact, or whether it was someone from Donovan's former unit who saw something on social media before the hour was out. What is known is that by 3:30 p.m., 19 minutes after the radio transmission, calls were being made to law enforcement contacts in 3 surrounding counties. Former Marines, men who had served alongside Donovan Mercer in Fallujah, in Helmand Province, in the kind of conditions that don't leave you and don't let you leave the people who stood beside you, were now on their phones. Some of them wore badges. Some of them knew people who did. All of them knew exactly who Donovan was, and none of them were willing to let what happened on Calverton Road sit without a response. One of those calls reached the desk of a senior officer in the Kellner County Sheriff's Department 22 miles away. Another reached a captain in a neighboring precinct who had served 2 years with Donovan's unit before transitioning to law enforcement. That captain made 4 calls of his own within the next 10 minutes. By 4 p.m., the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department had received 3 separate external inquiries about the incident at 4814 Calverton Road. Back at the church, Donovan was uncuffed at 3:17 p.m. No explanation was offered. No apology was made. Haskell removed the cuffs with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had decided his best option was to say as little as possible going forward. He handed Donovan his ID back without making eye contact. Donovan took it. He straightened his shirt. He touched the scrape on his cheekbone once, briefly, then lowered his hand. He walked back to where Sylvester and Cassius were standing, and he stood with them, and the three men said nothing to each other because nothing needed to be said. Lorinda Crane's phone was still recording. So were 4 others. The body cam on Haskell's chest had recorded everything from the moment he stepped out of his cruiser. The dismissal of the pastor, the tackle, the knee, the cuffs, the radio transmission, the uncuffing, all of it. In continuous, unedited, time-stamped footage. He drove away from Triumphant Grace Missionary Baptist Church at 3:24 p.m. He would never wear that badge again. The Hargrove County Sheriff's Department received the formal complaint at 9:17 a.m. on Monday morning. It didn't come from a lawyer. It didn't come from a civil rights organization. It came from Pastor Thaddeus Odom, who had gone home Sunday evening, sat at his kitchen table, and written 4 pages by hand detailing everything that had occurred at 4814 Calverton Road the previous afternoon. He signed it, dated it, and walked it into the department himself when they opened. By that same morning, the department had already received calls from 2 county sheriffs, 1 state-level law enforcement contact, and a retired Marine officer whose tone, by all accounts, had been extremely measured and extremely clear. The body cam footage had been flagged internally. 3 congregation members had already submitted their phone recordings through legal counsel. Haskell was placed on administrative leave before noon. The badge came off quietly, the way these things often do when institutions realize the cameras saw everything. There was no press conference, no statement of accountability. Just an internal notification that Officer Darren Haskell had been relieved of active duty pending a departmental review, and that his credentials had been suspended while the matter was being assessed. The department's public information officer released 4 sentences to the local press that said nothing and committed to nothing. What the department did not anticipate was how many people had been recording. By Tuesday, footage from 3 separate congregation members had been reviewed by an attorney retained by Donovan Mercer in the church. By Wednesday, that footage, along with a formal request for the body cam recording, had been submitted as part of a criminal assault complaint filed directly with the county prosecutor's office. The prosecutor, to his credit, did not sit on it. He reviewed the body cam footage personally. He watched Haskell bypass every reasonable option available to him, put a cooperative man on the ground, and then stand in that parking lot running ID checks while a pastor pleaded and a congregation watched. He filed charges within the week. The criminal trial took 4 months. Haskell's defense argued that the situation had been unpredictable, that Donovan's refusal to provide ID had created a lawful basis for the detainment, and that the force used was within acceptable parameters given the circumstances. The prosecution played the body cam footage in its entirety, all 19 minutes of it, without narration, without editorial, without interruption. They let it run from the moment Haskell stepped out of his cruiser to the moment he drove away at 3:24 p.m., and they let the jury watch it the same way 200 congregation members had watched it live on a Sunday afternoon on Calverton Road. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Darren Haskell was convicted of criminal assault. He was sentenced, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from serving in law enforcement in the state of Georgia. 17 prior complaints, 0 sustained. It took 19 minutes of body cam footage and 1 trial to accomplish what the department's own review process had refused to do across 9 years. The federal civil rights complaint filed by Triumphant Grace Missionary Baptist Church moved slower, the way federal processes do, but it moved. The complaint named the department directly. Not just Haskell, but the institutional pattern that had absorbed 17 complaints and produced no accountability, the supervisory failures, the review process that had functioned as a shield rather than an oversight mechanism. Federal investigators spent several months reviewing the department's disciplinary records. What they found was consistent enough to require a response. The resulting settlement mandated a full policy overhaul across the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department. Body cam footage review procedures were restructured. The complaint intake process was redesigned with independent oversight. Mandatory bias training was implemented department-wide, not as a one-day seminar, but as a recurring, documented requirement. It wasn't a perfect outcome, Real reform rarely arrives clean or complete, but the policies that had protected Darren Haskell for 9 years no longer existed in the same form. Donovan Mercer returned to triumphant grace the following Sunday. He sat in his usual seat, third pew from the front on the left side, where he had sat for nearly 3 decades. The scrape on his cheekbone had healed. He sang when the congregation sang. He bowed his head when Pastor Hezekiah prayed. After service, he stayed to help load the chairs. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it. The only way these stories reach the people they're meant to reach is when you pass them forward. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Deep Truth. We're not done yet.